everybody. Here we are. It's time for our final exam review for FA255. So let's just jump into it and find out what you need to know for the final exam, which is coming up real soon. So, and when I say real soon, it's coming up on Thursday. Just like the midterm, it will run for 1 week. So March 12 through March 19, and it's again, we'll be in the same place in the social science testing lab, and you've been there already. And the exam closes early on Thursday, so make sure and check their website to find out exactly. I do believe it's 5 o'clock, but I'm not sure, but I'm about 99% sure that on Thursday they will close at 5 o'clock, so you'll want to be aware of that. There will be no makeup exams, too bad. And check the Saturday hours, that's always the best time to do it. And it's the same type of question. There'll be 50 questions, all of them multiple choice, just similar, well, the same as the midterm. The study guides are now available on Moodle that you can download, and I think you're going to like them. If you haven't seen this final exam study guide yet, take a look at it. I think you'll be very pleased, and that's all I have to say about it. Remember that photo ID is required, 1 3x5 note card only. And
something wrong with our mic, but still somewhat hearing it through the ceiling. Oh, I see what happened.
Yeah, well, we got a technical difficulty here, folks, with the sound.
That should work.
Should I start over?
No.
No, okay. They're picking up, okay, there we go. It fell apart on us, folks. That's the joy of live television. Okay, and then I have this slide right up here on your screen, so I know where I was at. So remember, you need photo ID. Remember the 3x5 note card, just like last time. And be sure to check and verify the hours of the testing lab. All right. Now, a little discussion about your extra credit. Remember that you are allowed extra credit, and the way it works is simply if you consider a poor grade on your midterm, or if you anticipate a poor grade on your final exam, you can turn in an extra credit project. If you are doing that, the due date, the deadline is March 17, St. Patrick's Day at 10:30 in the morning. That's the day that it is due. Email submissions are okay, and but if you are going to print it and mail it to me as hard copy, make sure that it is postmarked no later than March 13th. That way that I know that it was sent in advance. So anyway, you know what you're doing. If you are involved in the extra credit, you know what you're doing, and make sure and have that in my hands on March 17th by 10:30. Okay, what will be on the exam? Everything since the midterm. So what that is we are covering everything from the combat film through what is occurring this week, the edge of Hollywood. And it includes all sorts of things as well, including film noir, film in the television age, and so forth. So let's take a look first at what should you know about the combat war film. Well, you should have a good idea of the features of the genre, in particular that laws and morality are suspended in war. So what was being promoted in the Western, for example, of trying to bring civilization to the Wild West, what is now is that a lot of these laws and a lot of the morality gets suspended for the good of the cause. Also, there is a switch now, an emphasis changes from the individual to the group, to the troops. So again, this is contrary to what we had seen in the Western. There's this switch, as you'll recall, in the Western, it is that individual, the rugged individual out there trying to bring civilization to the wilderness. And now it switches from that individual to a group in which we're all in this together. And the third point is women are seen as the emotional element that brings out male vulnerability. This is seen in so many of these films. It's almost a requirement. And all of these things, and as I say, I kind of set this against what the Western is, because when we look at the combat war film and we think of it during World War II, we immediately think of the same actor, John Wayne. Okay, the combat war film. Be aware of the anti-war sentiments of the post-war films. As we'll see when we talk about the Office of War Information, but during the war, films were made to bolster morale. And if we had anything to say about anti-war stuff, it would not be accepted. So once the war is over, the filmmakers are given much latitude in what happens, the reality of war. So keep that in mind. Also, war films and the portrayal of racial integration of the armed forces. That was discussed in our series. And it is, remember that there was racial segregation even in the services during the war, and it does not get integrated until Truman in 1947, 48, somewhere in there, that the service is finally integrated. Okay. The bottom line here is that the fundamental American philosophy or ideology embedded in the American war film is this: we may not always win physically, but we are always right ideologically. So again, that's the primary message that you're going to get out of the combat war film. We may not always win physically, that is, we lose some battles, but in the end, we are always right. That pretty much gets underscored with the help of the Office of War Information. And this was the role of the U.S. government in Hollywood film production. That number one, it was propaganda, and films were made to shape public opinion. What can I say about that other than simply boosting morale involved propaganda? And secondly, the Sergeant York formula was used over and over and over again in war films, which is depicting the conversion of a conscientious objector to a supporter. They even made Warner Brothers, in particular, Warner Brothers was very much pro-involvement in Europe before Pearl Harbor. Warner Brothers were very much in support of the war effort. And you have to remember, as the video series explained, that the country was pretty much divided right down the middle. They had seen the horrors of war in World War I, and there was an isolationist movement, a very, very strong, very strong effort to stay out of the war, particularly with regard to Europe, stay out of Europe's business. And on the other side of that, there were the people who were saying pretty much, we're needed. If we don't stop them over there, they can come over here. And with that, Hollywood was concerned, and Hollywood really did not want to get involved. Warner Brothers, in particular, got involved and began to produce a series of pro-war movies. As such, Warner Brothers was considered warmongers. And anyway, after Pearl Harbor, that all changed, and what we had was very much a war effort, and a lot of that was boosted by the Office of War Information. Now, interestingly, the Sergeant York formula was also used in 1968 in John Wayne's film, The Green Berets. It follows a reporter who is opposed to the war and his experiences over there with John Wayne, of course. By the time the movie is over, he's changed his mind and he becomes very much a supporter of it. So it's still being used all those years later, 20 years later, that formula is at work. Okay, also, film noir, everybody's favorite type of film. The question that is asked over and over again is this: is film noir a true genre? All right, that's a question that probably has an answer in the sense that everybody talks about it as being a genre. But the real question is it truly a genre? It's a French term which means black film. These movies are pretty much, they're the result of post-war filmmaking. You could probably trace it back some into the 30s, but when we really talk about film noir, we're talking about the 1940s and the 1950s. It's adaptations of American pulp fiction and hard-boiled novels. Now, the hard-boiled novel, that's the tough guy detective. They are discovered and debuted in post-war France. What our series meant about that is that it was the French critics in the Cahiers du Cinéma who began to write about these films. And primarily what they began to write about was the way the films looked. So in that regard, what we have is pretty much a style that they're looking at. And when it says debuted in post-war France, what it means is the French were saying, look at this type of film that we have that are made by Americans. Look at these types of films. They have all of these things going for them. And then later on, of course, we look at that even in our own culture, our American culture, and we go, oh, the French have seen these films. Let's take a look at these films. Hey, they're right. We've discovered here, they discovered a genre that we didn't even know we had, if you can call it a genre. And part of the reason why we question that is because in most cases when we talk about it, we begin to talk about its style. We begin to talk about things like settings and what they did with the settings. First of all, it takes place in urban areas. It's right in the middle of town, middle of the city. It is also usually at night. Almost all of the great film noir features are done at night with rain-slicked streets that give us a very interesting look to them, especially in black and white, because we begin to see this wonderful chiaroscuro lighting effects. And it's if it's set in the city, it's usually the sleazy side of city life. It is very much a place that you don't go at night. The themes that we find in these films. First, it's alienation. We find characters who are alienated from each other. They're alienated from their own culture. They're alienated from society. They're just loners. They're all by themselves. We see existentialism in there in the sense that there is no exit. These people are doomed, and it can be very simply the city that dooms you. It's there's no escape, and your life is being dictated by the city. The character types that inhabit these themes are amnesiacs. Often there is someone who has lost his memory or her memory, and the effort is to somehow, I'm involved in a crime, I'm involved in some kind of degradation, I'm involved in some kind of city mania here, but I don't know how I got here. I don't know why I'm involved. What is it? Did I do something? We already mentioned the loners, and that's what it is. They are antisocial loners. They are so far removed from the social order that they practically become freaks. They are just so different from everyone else. And in many cases, the hero is a private detective. This comes from the influence of the hard-boiled novels. The private detective is private in the sense that, of course, he doesn't work for the city. He doesn't work for the establishment. He works for himself. And as such, he can get away with things that otherwise he couldn't if he worked for the social order. So all of these kinds of characters inhabit this world of darkness. The style itself is what attracts us so often. It is the style that attracts us to film noir. And here they are, as I take a drink, excuse me. Yes, we have low-key lighting, which you've already know about and understand. There are shadowy elements. Some of those great films have these unbelievable shadow effects where only a partial face is seen. They have strange highlights. Yes, they are highlighted in odd ways. And, of course, extreme camera angles, what they call Dutch angles often, in which the camera is askew. It's just slanted a bit. We have high angles and low angles, and in some cases, outright distortion, especially with very wide angle lenses, almost like a fisheye lens. They don't have them at that time that they're making these films, but they're a very wide angle which distorts things, and we have lots of depth with shooting through objects and things like that. So this creates for us this style that creates this film noir. Now, we talk about this, and we talk about it as style, and I can say that, yeah, is film noir a true genre, or is it simply a style? Because a lot of these things that we just talked about, you can find in a film that is considered film noir, and that is Citizen Kane. So, all right, we move on. Also be aware of the production code in film noir. They're getting a little more daring after the war. And part of the reason for it is because how are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris? You can pretty much say that all the soldiers are coming back. They've seen things that people really aren't supposed to see as such. I mean, the violence, the decadence of dictatorship and those kinds of things, and then the violence, the death and destruction that comes with war. It's a different world. It's a changed world. And what we have now with film noir is just a little bit different. We're dealing with things that were considered prohibited subjects, and they do this very carefully without directly violating the code. The gender issues in film noir also become very important because women are seen as femme fatales. Women have absolute control in many of the film noir movies. They control men. And as some critics, feminist critics, have pointed out, that this film only reflected what was happening in our own culture. Because remember, Rosie the Riveter went to work for the war effort. And the war's over, and the men come back, and they're supposed to have their jobs back. And Rosie says, wait a minute, I like what I'm doing. I don't want to leave my job. So women are getting daring. They're putting a foot forward. And film noir is often said to reflect that. So in summary then, film noir is a social commentary on post-war reality, which is this: modern mass American culture. Yes, the mass American culture is found inside cities, masses that gather together to form huge metropolitan areas. It's associated with consumerism, and it is pretty much a disillusionment with paradise lost. The paradise that was promised to us in the Western is now lost in the film noir. There is just simply no exit, and we're victims of our surroundings. No better place to see this than in a 60-minute film. Yes, it only runs an hour, called Detour, which is one of the best film noir features ever made, and it's worth seeing, and you can see it everywhere and anywhere because it's in the public domain. Okay, we move on into one of my favorite topics, film in the television age. And this is a continuation of what we were just talking about how things have changed. And what we have here is suddenly a post-war decline in attendance. Now, part of this is the threat of television, and that's the easy target. That during the 1950s, it is TV, a new form of entertainment. It was available and was being worked on in the 1930s, but the war changed all of that. And with the war over and with the advancement in technology, thanks to the war, the television now becomes very much available to everybody. It takes it some time throughout the 1950s, but it continues to develop and it continues to become more and more inexpensive, and it becomes available to just about anybody. But TV is not the only culprit. There is simply more leisure time. We now have the 40-hour work week. There is more money because our economy is booming. It's a post-war boom in many respects. There's high inflation, but there are more people working. And there is interest in other activities. And as I mentioned way back at the start of our series, that the most popular diversion at the 1950s was bowling. And with all of that horrible stuff going on in the city and the cramping people into the city, there is migration to the suburbs now. You can move out just outside of town. But television remains the primary culprit, and there are agreements between the motion picture industry and TV. Eventually, what it is, the motion picture studios see TV as a subsidiary market for motion pictures. The studios can not only produce their own TV shows, but they see TV as a way of advertising their feature films. But to get people into the theaters, they needed to make changes. And in this television age, the response from the movie industry to competition from television and the decline in attendance is technical innovations. They're going to give you something in the theater that you can't get on that tiny little glowing box in your living room. The first thing that they work on is the size of the screen. In the old days, at the aspect ratio, which is the width to height of projected image, was 1.33 to 1. And that is considered, in the movie industry, that was considered the flat. Instead, they put on a lens that had been developed way back even during the silent era to create what they call the scope image, which was 2.35 to 1. Essentially just twice the size, twice the width. And so CinemaScope becomes the thing. You go into a theater and you see spanning horizons. You see all of that incredible imagery. Also in this we have the different kinds, which were mentioned in the video series. You have Cinerama, which is the widest of the widescreen, and that allows you to see things peripherally and puts you in the picture, as it were. CinemaScope just creates the long, a rectangle. And then they talked about the invention of Panavision, which supersedes CinemaScope because it's a finer lens, creates a sharper image, and becomes the standard by the 1960s. Now, with these kinds of movies being shown, these widescreen movies, what are you going to do when you show these films to television? Well, you change them, and our series was very wanted to emphasize that. What you do is with panning and scanning, which is a very weird thing to do, which used to drive me nuts, and then you letterbox it and remember the safe action area. Also, during the 1950s, you have creative innovations by now independent producers. One of them is a company called American International Pictures that begins in the 1950s. Of all things, when there is low attendance and when theaters are closing, a company is developed, American International Pictures, but it sees a market out there that has been untapped, and it is the teen market. So they begin to make pictures that are expressly for teenagers who are not only flocking to downtown houses, but also we have suddenly the development everywhere of drive-in theaters. And in order to get product into the drive-in theaters, one of the things that brings the audiences, primarily young people, monsters. So low-budget exploitation films, often that use monsters, are made and shown and make bazillions of dollars. Those with titles like I Was a Teenage Werewolf, I Was a Teenage Frankenstein, and so forth. And what you have then is independent producing, making these films at very low budgets and getting money. You know, the return on these budgets are phenomenal. So even the major studios begin to produce these kinds of films. So what you have in the 1950s is really a reliance on monsters. And we've never seen a genre develop and collapse as rapidly as it did in the 1950s with regard to monsters. Okay, in the 1960s, there is a transition. The older generation looks at mature movies with Rock Hudson, Doris Day, and a film called Lover Come Back, whereas the younger generation in the 1960s, by the end of the 60s, see that kind of a film in The Graduate. And then we have the counterculture movement. You have the ideological war of Vietnam and the generational war, which is World War II. And so you have this conflict between baby boomers and conservative elders. The 1960s, crazy time. It's the climate is just plain nuts. You have assassinations and violence in the streets and so forth. And then you also have the sexual revolution, where now movies are going to be free to do whatever they want to. Everything from the suggestion of sexuality to the depiction of nudity, all the way to the extreme where they actually show us sexuality. In other words, we're peeping Toms. What Hitchcock always said we were, peeping Toms. The images of women, images of youth, the images of race, all of these things are being discussed in the 1960s in the film school generation, which is where now what we have are people, young students who are going to school to become filmmakers. You learn how to make films. The premier student filmmaker of all time, Francis Ford Coppola, one of the first, who's learning how to make movies at USC and then ends up making movies and ends up making one of the finest of all movies ever made, The Godfather. Okay, the MPA ratings change. We no longer have censorship at all. What we have is pretty much everything's wide open, and they create an idiotic thing of ratings. You have the new wave to consider. These are the French movie critics who discover American classic films. They produce a journal, Cahiers du Cinéma. These same people, these are critics who become filmmakers themselves. This spills over into the American side, where Andrew Sarris creates this same kind of idea about filmmakers. And then you have, again, all of these, Dennis Hopper, Bogdanovich, and Coppola were all protégés of one of those guys that started making monster movies, Roger Corman. And you have the Brat Pack, the Reagan years of making films. Okay, it goes on. And the bottom line here is become familiar with modern filmmakers and examples of their works. The modernist filmmakers are essentially Lucas, Spielberg, Scorsese, and also the filmmakers on the fringes. An example of that is Julie Dash. And really, the bottom line there is simply that a movie just ain't a movie anymore. And that's pretty, I'm not going to go through all of those things. The bottom line here is to remember it's now horizontal control, the diversification of the film industry, merchandising tie-ins and everything, and it's all synergy. And pretty much that's it. Okay, we've reached it. Remember those things. It starts Thursday, continues for a week, and your extra credit is due on March 17th. That's it. See you around. Bye. You got through it.